Hello and welcome to Unleashed. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm really excited to be here today with Alex Brueckmann, who is the author of The Strategy Legacy: How to Future-Proof a Business and Leave Your Mark. And he has another book, Creating the Strategy Legacy, as well. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Will. Thanks for the kind introduction.
So first, let's define terms. What is strategy?
Great question. I am if you want, a pupil of Roger Martin's when it comes to that definition. In simple terms, strategy is the handful of integrated choices that you make to win in your chosen marketplace. So a theory about how you win, not just play the game to play.
Okay. So let's expand that a little bit more. You might be, I think I read the same book there about Playing to Win, right, by
Hmm.
Roger Martin and Lafley,
Yep.
and they talk about several questions. One is, I think, defining what is winning, uh, saying where do we play, how do we win, and kind of what's the plan to get there. But I'm going from memory. Tell me a little bit more, just expand a little bit more. If we have a strategy, what questions is it answering? What does that look like? If we had a strategy on paper, what does it include?
Yeah. Let me start by saying most companies that I've worked with or that I've seen from the inside, they actually do not have a strategy. They have a certain amount of documents that they would refer to as a strategy, but when you take a look at those, they often consist a long list of ideas, lofty goals, sometimes very specific projects. But when you take a look at them, the defining criteria of strategy for me is that what you do needs to be cohesive and integrated, which simply is another way of saying if you do all these things, they need to make sense together. So you can't just say, I want to do a project in marketing. I want to build a new plant. I'm going to focus on our operations, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's not just a laundry list of projects. These things need to come together into a cohesive story. So in a very simple way, what your strategy needs to answer is, what will you do and what do you think you will achieve by doing that? So strategy as such is a theory of how you win. It's not we do X, Y, Z, and then the result is ABC. It is more like, let's understand how we can create value in a way that convinces or influences our customers or potential customers to buy from us, not from others. So I think the defining criteria of a good strategy is that it is about the customer and not about who does what by when and budget allocation and things like that, because that's internal. A good strategy is focused on the customer, who is external, who you cannot control.
So if we have a company that, let's say they have a strategy that you would sign off on as, hey, this is an A plus strategy, right? This is a well done strategy. Give us an example of what that might look like. Just what's on that piece of paper.
So if we talk about a strategy on a page, which I often hear from clients, what we try to help them achieve is not the details on that page. It's about the story that you tell. So if you meet one of your employees, for example, or your next leadership level, or whomever that is, your board of directors, what is the story that you tell them? So it is about understanding what you do and for whom. So what is your offering and who is your customer? And those questions seem so simple, yet they are so explosive. For most businesses, these questions end up in hour-long quarrels or discussions, if you want. Um, so that's the first thing that needs to be on that page, to understand what you do and for whom. Call it your niche, call it whatever you want to do. I call it mission. So what is it you do and for whom? I think Patrick Lencioni once defined it as a business definition. So if you understand it from that perspective, that's the first thing that you need to understand. So if you have that clear, the next piece on that one page needs to be, how does your business look like in a few years from now? And that's not like a lofty vision statement that you put on a marketing flyer or God knows what. That needs to be just a few sentences that clearly describe how you feel your business needs to look like in, let's say, 2 or 3 years. And that's then what you can work toward. So you basically define the end state of your business, end state of your strategy cycle. What is it that you will have achieved by implementing that strategy? And then you define what it is that you will actually do. And that is your strategy. Those are your integrated set of choices that I mentioned in the beginning. So knowing what you do and for whom, knowing what you work toward, and knowing what the few choices are that you need to make, like let's say the 20% of the things that make 80% of the impact, that you will then over-index on and focus all your resources on.
You work with companies to help them develop their strategy. Walk me through the process that you lead your clients through.
Well, the starting point is very, very different depending on the client, right? So some companies that approach us are Inc. 5000 businesses, fast growing startups. Very often they don't have a strategy in place at all. They are either like extremely opportunity driven or extremely tech driven or whatever it is. So you can actually start from scratch with them and define all elements of their identity, including the business strategy. Other businesses like the automotive OEMs we're working with or pharma companies, they do have something in place. They don't start from scratch. So you focus maybe more on a particular aspect of strategy or on a particular aspect of their identity. What the process in big terms, if I try to describe the process as such, what I typically do with my clients first is help them understand the playing field they're on. And that means understanding the recent past changes and challenges that they went through, so that you can align them around what the reality actually looks like. And that is surprisingly difficult for many executive teams to align on what the reality looks like. Everyone has a different perspective on things. So doing that is extremely helpful as a first step. Once you've achieved that, you can actually talk about the future. You can talk about those changes and challenges that come your way over the coming years. And what you then do is dissect those changes and challenges into opportunities for you. And you realize at some point that what might look like a challenge or a threat is eventually not that threatening at all. So you define in that process, in discussing those changes and challenges, you start to define your target market, you start to define your target clients. And by doing that, you have a clear understanding of your market. And then the next step is understanding, if that is my market, what do I have to do so that clients choose us over our competitor? And in many industries, that is a very interesting question because they have never approached it from that perspective. They have approached it from the perspective of, let's take credit unions, for example. One of the clients I'm currently working with is a credit union. And that is an industry that is, let's say, one of the most complacent I have ever seen in my life. These businesses, these credit unions, they sometimes don't even understand themselves as businesses. They don't understand themselves as a player in a market where they should aim to win. They have been around for a very, very long time. And it's not about playing to win. It's about playing to play. It's about a very romantic approach to doing business. And these questions help them to kind of wake up, to get out of their complacency and think about the market and their product and their industry and their customers in very different ways. And at that point in the process of working with them, like every project is entirely different because you never know where you get to at that point in the process. And it's really about helping the customer understand that they cannot do everything that they want to do. Every company has finite resources. and the conversations about what is a must-have move and what is a nice-to-have move, and helping them bring those moves into a logic sequence and into a cohesive construct, that is then the art and science of strategy, if you want.
You have a framework in your book, The 9 Elements of Organizational Identity. Walk me through that framework.
Well, the 9 elements of organizational identity is, I think, every aspect in that is known to humankind. The question is, do you understand it in an integrated way? I'm a very visual person, so what I did is all the aspects that I typically work with my clients on, I brought them into 3 concentric circles. And the reason I did that is because very often when you start to talk about strategy, for example, you realize that a strategy process touches on so many different aspects that it would be a shame if you wouldn't use that one process to refresh those elements of your identity. For example, if you start talking about customers, if you start talking about customer experience, you start talking about how do we want to be with our customers? What is the experience like? And that touches on who are we as a company? Who are we as human beings? What is the impact that we want to have by providing a certain service to the world? So at the core of those 3 concentric circles, at the center circle, there's this impact that I mentioned, which is literally the question. It answers the question of if we put our purpose into practice, into action, what is the tangible impact that we create? And it also answers questions that are deeper than that, like questions around which values guide our actions. So values and behaviors are in that first concentric circle. And the third one I already mentioned is that piece around mission. Like, what do we actually do and whom do we serve? The reason I call it organizational identity is, and not business identity, is that those 9 elements, they are relevant whether you are a government agency, whether you are a not-for-profit environmental protection company, or whether you are a for-profit entity. So once you've answered those 3 questions, you move into that center circle where the next 3 elements of identity would sit, which are your strategy, the choices that you make, which you can.
Alex, before you get into that, let me just recap what I heard. And I'm referring to the book as well. So that inner circle, again, we got impact, mission, and principles.
Correct.
And from your book, I'm reading just the definitions just to help recap. So impact is the change you want to create based on your purpose, your reason to exist as an organization. And mission is what an organization aims to do and for whom. And principles are the underlying values and behavioral guidelines. Just could you help me just clarify the difference between impact and mission? Impact is the change you want to create, and mission is what an organization aims to do. How do you differentiate those two?
Yeah, good question. They are very, very different things. So, for example, the mission of a vehicle company is to produce vehicles, right? That's what they do. They produce vehicles. They sell, produce, market vehicles to a certain target group. It's as simple as that. If you take a look at what environmental protection agencies do, they protect habitat and wildlife. That's as simple as that. But the impact that they create through that is way, way deeper than that. Going back to the automotive company, the impact that they have on the lives of their customers, depending on the market where they're at, can be tremendous. Like producing affordable vehicles in a third world country can be an absolute game changer for a family who doesn't have to rely on, let's say, public transport so much. That might be inefficient, unreliable, etc. And depending on the security situation in your country, having your own vehicle can also be a game changer. So the impact that you have on the lives of people by providing them a certain service or product is different than your definition of your business. And when it comes to the Environmental Protection Agency that I mentioned, of course, their mission is to protect habitat and wildlife, but the impact that that has is way, way deeper, and it goes way beyond that. It's about securing biodiversity. It's about protecting life on Earth and helping our ecosystem stay intact, which has a very direct impact on all of us.
All right. So your definition of mission is like the product or service you're providing and what customers you're providing it to. That's kind of it's the
Correct.
what
Yeah,
you're actually producing. Whereas the impact, it sounds a little bit like the concept of jobs to be done. It's what is that product or service then like what's the like what is the job that those a product or service is providing? Like what's the change on that person's life or that organization's life from being able to get that product or service?
exactly. What would disappear from this planet if your company closed shop? That's
Yeah.
the impact. So
Okay.
if there is nothing that happens if your company closes shop, you actually do not have an impact. So there is no real value in the product or service that you provide.
Okay, great. Okay, so that was the inner circle. Okay, so now lead us on to the middle circle.
So that middle circle is literally your business strategy. It's how you create it, and those three elements that I associate with strategy. One of them I already mentioned. It's that vision piece. How does your business look like in a few years down the road that you can work toward? So it's not a marketing claim, a lofty statement that you put on your website. It is a very specific description of how the business will look like once you have implemented your strategy. That is the first element. The second element is then your strategy as such, the choices that you make and how you visually depict them, for example, using a strategy map or any other tool that you choose to use. And the third element is your measurable goals. So it hurts me when I sometimes walk into the door of a company and they show me what their current strategy looks like. And then you see basically a list of great sounding goals, very aspirational goals, but there is little smartness about it in the sense of smart goals. They're not specific, they're not measurable, they don't tell you what it is that you need to action in order to get there. They're not timed, and they try to make up for that lack of specificity with passion. Like, it's all about passion, it's all about chaka, we can do this. But that's unfortunately not how strategy works. You need that passion, of course. That's the fire in your belly that makes you get up in the morning. But then what? So having that vision clear, having the intermediate goals clear that you want to achieve, and depicting that in some sort of visual, like a strategy map, can really help you understand whether the story that you're telling with your strategy is actually cohesive.
All right, great. Now let's go to the outer circle.
The outer circle of identity is comprised of management system, capabilities, and targets. And if you think about what that outer circle is, think about a scaffolding that you build around a tower to avoid that it breaks down again, or any other kind of structure that you build. You can have the greatest strategy in place in theory, but if you do not enable everyone in the business to either lead in a way that it helps to implement strategy, if you don't help your individual contributors understand how their job matters and how what they do helps build that vision and achieve your strategy, then nothing will happen. Like businesses, I always say businesses don't implement strategy. People do. And if people understand how they do that, it unleashes incredible motivation. That sense of contribution is what people often lack in businesses. They just don't see how their job matters. So having those capabilities in place is super important to help people achieve the second element in that outer circle, their individual targets. And these are more than just, business numbers. Of course, depending on where you work, these might include sales numbers, these might include other metrics, but this is way more than just about the numbers. This is about understanding how you show up every day, for example, is in line with the values and the behavioral guidelines that you defined as part of your identity. So these targets need to be both cultural and strategic. And then the third element in that outer circle, that's what I call management systems. That's literally now that I have clarity about where we want to go and how we get there, how do you adjust your structure and your processes of an organization so that it supports the change? The problem is every company has processes, every company has systems and structures and meeting cadences and God knows what. These are all part of your management systems. And the reason you created them is to help the company stay stable and run stable and develop. But they are not designed for change. So it's kind of like building new bridges that you can use in the future, and then tearing down the old ones, so that the management structures or management systems that you build are the ones that actually create the strategy, that support the strategy implementation, and that support the culture you want to see in your business. So when you talk about values, when you talk about behavioral guidelines, and all your leadership is incentivized in different ways that are not in line with that, chances are that they will not focus too much on those values and behavioral guidelines, but more on what maximizes their year-end bonus, if you know what I mean.
I'd like to revisit the part about, so it was helpful to walk us through all those 9 elements of the identity. For someone who is listening and says, okay, great, how do I actually put this in practice and, get from here to there? Could you walk through just a little bit more detail? How do you actually implement this? So before you walked us through several steps, the first was, understanding the playing field, the recent past, and what does reality look like? So what specific activities or analyses or questions would someone do in just that first phase that to help them, prepare the foundation to create their strategy?
Yeah. So when we talk about, for example, values and behavioral guidelines, we try to avoid these conversations around, those values that you print on posters and hang up in the corridors or plaster your PowerPoint deck with. And we're trying to look deeper. We're trying to look into what we call emotional culture and rational culture. So what are the few, maybe it's only one, maybe it's only two, what are the few, we call them diamond values, that define who you are as a business? And we call them diamond value for a reason. They are hard to alter even under pressure. So that's just who you are. That's what you're willing to lose clients, for example, if you realize that the way they treat you is not in line with your own diamond values. And we help companies understand what that actually means. And the distinction between a rational and an emotional culture goes back to what Sigal Barsade of Wharton produced in her lifetime, to help people understand that there is a difference between, for example, doing the right thing and talking about business and the words that you use to describe, for example, your playing field, your strategy, etc. And that there is an emotional culture around the types of conversations that you want people to have in an organization. And that includes things like, for example, how do you help people grow? How do you help people see the impact of their behaviors, of how they show up in meetings, of how they show up in interactions with external stakeholders, for example? And that is really about understanding, helping people understand of who they are. So it becomes this conversation that goes way beyond strategy, way beyond bottom line and numbers. And, it's more about understanding, how do I create an environment in my business that can become over time what I call a human-centric performance culture? How do you help people show up every day at their best, whatever that best is? Your best is different every day, but to have these conversations that are more than just helping people create revenue, helping people solve problems, but a space where people want to be the best version of themselves, because they know that it's a privilege to work in a business that is focused on them as human beings as well, not just on the bottom line.
I want to highlight in chapter 5 of your book, rolling up the sleeves. You really get down to business of walking through these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different aspects or different kind of approaches, right? Or sources of insight for the strategy process.
Yeah.
Those are, executive interviews, the foundation
Mm.
session, strategy workshop, research phase, refinement workshops, workstream deep dives, organizational intent creation, and strategy reviews. Um, Give us kind of just the quick overview of those different aspects.
If you ever thought about becoming a strategy facilitator, let's assume you're an executive coach. Let's assume you have conversations about all kinds of topics with your customers. And from time to time, most likely the topic of strategy comes up. And if you've ever been in that situation where you thought, I wonder how I could facilitate a process like this, well, those are the stepstones that you just mentioned. If you want to help a customer create a business strategy, if you just take those 8 steps and understand them, you can be a tremendous resource as a facilitator for executive teams, for example. Executive interviews, foundation session, and strategy workshop, those are the starting points of every great conversation around strategy. And we start with executive interviews because we want to understand the level of strategic acumen within a group of people, be it an executive team or whoever the strategy core team may entail in a company. We want to understand what happened in the past, what they tried, what worked, how urgent and important they perceive, for example, a new strategy process to start. It might just be the idea of the CEO, and we realize in these interviews that actually no one thinks that this is needed. So then we have a different conversation. Our foundation session then looks different, and as if we feel like everyone's fired up, they are already aligned, they know exactly what they want, and they only need us to facilitate the process so that they don't lose themselves in details. So the foundation session in the end helps us answer some of those foundational questions that we talked about in the beginning of our conversation. And they also help us play back to the people that we interviewed what we actually see. As a fly on the wall, they talk to us. We play back where we feel they're at in terms of readiness to start a strategy process. And once we've cleared the air, once we've have created that understanding of what we do and for whom, we can actually start to work on strategy. And that is what that strategy session, that third step in those building blocks entails. This is when you start to transition from understanding the reality, understanding who you are. We might have done some work around values and behavioral guidelines in that foundation session. That is when you then transition into the future. And this is where it becomes difficult for many people, because the questions that we ask are not easy to answer. And we need to create an environment, a space where we can have honest and vulnerable conversations around strategy, where it's not the ones with the loudest voice or those who process their thinking by talking them out loud, suck up the air in the room. It's our job as facilitators then to make sure that not the loudest ideas win, but that the best ideas are being discussed. And these are intense sessions, but the way we facilitate them helps people become vulnerable, bring their ideas forward. And this is where the magic happens, when you start to talk about things in the future that are outside of your comfort zone. So one absolute essential element of any successful strategy process for me as a facilitator is that I help people get rid of their roles, get rid of their day-to-day job. They must become stewards of the entire business. They don't show up as the marketing lead. They don't show up as the sales lead. They don't show up as the finance guy. They show up as a steward for the entire business. And if you manage to let your day job behind and to imagine what a business can become, that's when you step into a really magical space.
Now, I believe that you are about to offer a certification program for facilitation.
That is actually true. It's in the near future. It's not there yet, but by the time this podcast airs, it is most likely a bit further down the road. So we've realized over the past 10, 15 years that it's extremely difficult to find people that can facilitate strategy processes in the way we do it. So we're not consultants. We have consultant backgrounds. Yes, we did strategy consulting in the past. But we realize that that is not what companies need. Companies need people who can help them create a safe space so that they can do their magic. And it's not us coming in telling others what to do, how to run their business, what we think they should do. It's not about us. And yeah, that certification program that we're offering is targeted toward executive coaches, facilitators, workshop facilitators who are external resources who help their clients through certain services like workshop facilitation, like executive coaching, and are interested in having those eye-to-eye conversations on strategy as well. And there are also the certification program is also targeted toward internal resources like strategy managers, like PMO managers, who often find themselves in situations in rooms with executives where they are in a role of facilitating, of pushing forward, of moving the group out of the rabbit holes back into the process. So yeah, that's what's coming soon.
All right. Where can listeners go to find out more about that once it launches?
That heavily depends on whether people are brave enough to write my surname. Then they can go to brueckmann.ca, BRUECKMANN.ca, or a way easier way is to go to alexthestrategist.com.
All right, Alex the Strategist. One final question about the book. How did you get Marshall Goldsmith to blog your book, to blurb your book? That's very impressive. You have a blurb from Marshall Goldsmith.
Yeah, that's a funny story. Marshall and I ran into each other at Seattle Airport while we both were on a layover. He just landed from a gig in the Middle East. I was about to fly to New York to a client, and I ran into him sort of, and I was like, "That is Marshall," and he was standing next to a trash can, having a phone call. So I kept my distance and waited until he had finished his call. I introduced myself, and at that point, Marshall and I both employed the same marketing agency for some of our work. So and we're loosely in contact, but we've never met before. So we had lunch together, and then one thing led to another, and he offered to endorse my book, which was very kind, the kind man that he is.
That's pretty sweet. And for listeners who aren't aware, Marshall Goldsmith is probably the most famous executive coach in the world. And he also runs this group, like 100 coaches, where he's coaching 100 coaches who are top notch. So that's pretty cool to have Marshall Goldsmith give a nice comment on your book. He says, "It's full of practical advice. This book takes the guesswork out of developing a winning strategy," according to Marshall Goldsmith. Alex, as you mentioned already, the links to your firm, I think it's alexthestrategist.com and brueckmann.ca. We'll include those links in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining today.
I appreciate the conversation, Will. Really great questions, going deep into the content. I bet that was valuable for a lot of your listeners. Thank you very much for having me.